Mark, a lonely boy, helps an elderly man carry heavy grocery bags upstairs, unaware that this small act of kindness will change his life. The next day, a luxury SUV stops in front of his house, and a mysterious man steps out, offering an enticing proposition. "If you need anything, just call me." Mark doesn't know that one simple decision could set off a chain of unexpected events. Will he dare to step into this new world? What do you think about these unexpected decisions? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if this story intrigues you, don't forget to subscribe to explore the exciting twists ahead. Mark's worn sneakers scraped the cracked pavement as he made his way home from school. The dull thud of his footsteps echoed through the empty streets, a lonely rhythm that matched the weight in his chest. He pulled his jacket tighter around his thin frame, the chilly breeze biting at his skin. It was just another afternoon, another walk home from the same old school, through the same quiet neighborhood. But today, something felt different. As Mark turned the corner near his house, his eyes landed on an old man struggling with heavy grocery bags. The man's frail hands trembled as he tried to juggle the weight of the bags, his body bent with the effort. He was just a few steps away from the stairs leading up to his home. The sight was nothing unusual. People around here often struggled with the little things, but something about the old man's strained movements hit Mark harder than usual. Without thinking, he stopped, his heart pounding a little faster than before. The decision to help was swift but hesitant, one of those impulsive choices that came from some deeper instinct. "I need some help with those?" Mark's voice cracked slightly, breaking the silence in the otherwise still street. The elderly man froze, startled, then gave a soft, almost apologetic chuckle. "Oh, well, I guess I do. These bags feel heavier than when I picked them up." Mark wasn't sure why the man's words lingered in his mind. Something about the helplessness in his tone. But he didn't have time to think about it. He was already stepping forward, reaching for the bags. "Yeah, they look pretty heavy," Mark said, his tone rough with the exhaustion of his own day. "Let me help you up the stairs." The old man blinked, pausing for a moment before nodding, a faint smile creasing his tired face. Not many kids your age offer to help these days. Mark couldn't look him in the eye. He just nodded and lifted the bags, feeling their weight like a burden pressing into his own chest. He couldn't say why it felt like such a big deal to him. Maybe it was because deep down he didn't feel like he could do anything else to help anyone, not with what he had at home, not with the mess his life was becoming. He didn't say another word as they climbed the stairs. When they reached the top, Mark hesitated, unsure of what to do. The old man seemed to know. "You're a good kid," Mr. Howard murmured as he took the bags from Mark, his eyes softening with gratitude. "Not many people take the time to do something like this anymore." Mark just shifted uncomfortably, not used to praise. It's nothing, really," he muttered, glancing away quickly. He turned, ready to leave, but Mr. Howard's voice stopped him. "Thank you," Mr. Howard called out, his voice filled with something more than just politeness. "You give me a bit of hope, seeing someone like you helping out. It means more than you know." Mark didn't respond. He couldn't. He just walked away faster, the awkward weight of the moment sticking to him like the burden of the bags. As Mark stepped through his front door, he was hit with the familiar, suffocating scent of old cooking and stale air. The warmth of home didn't feel quite as welcoming as it used to. He dropped his backpack by the door and froze. His mom was standing at the kitchen counter, staring at the crumpled piece of paper. Her hands, once graceful and strong, now trembled as she smoothed it out. "Ma?" Mark asked, trying to sound casual as he walked closer. But even he could hear the anxiety in his voice. She didn't look up immediately, but the forced smile she gave him was hollow. "It's just nothing you need to worry about, Mark." Mark's gaze dropped to the paper on the counter. An overdue rent notice, the numbers in bold black ink too clear to ignore. He swallowed hard, his throat suddenly dry. The familiar feeling of helplessness crept in, but he shoved it aside, trying not to let it show. "It's the rent, isn't it?" Mark's voice was barely a whisper. His mother sighed deeply, the weight of the situation too much for her to hide. "Don't worry about it," she said, but it was a lie. "I'm talking to Mr. Rodriguez. I'll get an extension. We'll be fine." The words were meant to comfort him, but they only made him feel more helpless. He wanted to believe her, he really did, but the reality of their situation hung in the air like a thick fog. Every day felt like they were slipping further away from stability. Mark turned away from his mother, his mind racing with thoughts he couldn't shake. What if they weren't fine? What if things didn't work out? He wanted to help, but how could he? What could a kid like him do when his mom was drowning in a sea of bills and overdue notices? But as he stared out the window, watching the sun sink lower in the sky, he made a silent promise to himself. He wasn't going to just sit by and watch. There had to be something he could do. He wasn't sure what yet, but he was going to find out. The next day, Mark barely noticed the black luxury SUV until it pulled to a stop in front of their small house. He had just stepped outside, the weight of yesterday still hanging over him, his mind lost in thoughts of how to fix things at home. As the engine quieted, Mark's eyes instinctively shifted toward the sleek, polished vehicle. The contrast between the SUV and his own modest surroundings was sharp, and he couldn't help but feel out of place. The door swung open and a man stepped out, tall, well-dressed in a tailored suit with a confident air about him. His demeanor screamed power, something Mark wasn't used to seeing up close. The man adjusted his sunglasses before striding toward him, a wide, practiced smile plastered on his face. "You must be Mark," the man said, extending his hand in greeting. His voice was smooth, almost too polished. "I'm James Howard. My father told me about you, how you helped him with his groceries yesterday." Mark's heart skipped a beat. The way James said it made it seem so casual, as if they were already friends, as if this was just another normal day for him. But to Mark, everything about this felt off. The suit, the car, the confident smile. It felt like an intrusion into his world. "Yeah, I helped him," Mark replied, his voice tight as he eyed James warily. "Is everything okay?" James chuckled softly, an amused glint in his eyes. "Everything's fine, Mark. I just wanted to thank you for helping my father. He mentioned how much you did for him and I wanted to return the favor." Mark felt his stomach twist. He wasn't sure what to make of the situation. He was used to helping people out of kindness, not out of some obligation or hidden agenda. "You don't have to," Mark muttered, not sure if he was talking to James or himself. James, unfazed, reached into his suit pocket and pulled out a business card, handing it over to Mark with a smile that seemed a little too rehearsed. "But I insist. If you ever need anything, work, money, whatever, just give me a call." Mark hesitated. The offer felt strange, too generous, and Mark's instincts told him there was more to this than met the eye. But despite the unease crawling up his spine, he took the card. James didn't wait for a response. He gave Mark a pat on the shoulder, his smile never faltering, before turning back to the SUV. "Take care, Mark. I'm sure we'll see each other soon." As James slid into the car, Mark stood frozen, staring at the card in his hand. It was thick, embossed with gold lettering. James Howard, entrepreneur, CEO. Mark had seen his type before, powerful, wealthy, and seemingly unbothered by the struggles people like him went through every day. He tucked the card into his pocket. His thoughts tangled in confusion. He wasn't sure if he should be grateful or suspicious. One thing was clear. This wasn't some simple gesture of kindness. Back inside the house, Mark found his mother sitting at the kitchen table, a weary expression on her face. She was staring at a crumpled bill on the counter, something she'd probably been avoiding. Mark couldn't stand seeing her like this, the weight of their financial problems pressing down on her, but he also knew better than to try and fix everything himself. She'd never let him. He placed the card on the table in front of her, his hand shaking slightly. "Ma, this is from James Howard, Mr. Howard's son. He said if we ever need anything, work, money, whatever, we could call him." Mark's voice trailed off, unsure how to say what he was really feeling, that gut-wrenching mix of suspicion and hope. Mark's mom's eyes flicked to the card, her expression hardening instantly. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and for a long moment, she said nothing. Mark could see the tension in her jaw, the way her hands gripped the edge of the table, as if she were trying to hold herself together. She shook her head, her voice tight with unspoken anger. People like that don't help without expecting something in return. We don't owe anyone, especially not someone like him. Mark opened his mouth to protest, but his mother's words struck deep. He had always admired her strength, but sometimes her pride blinded her to the reality of their situation. They were sinking, and the offer James had made, no matter how off-putting it seemed, was a lifeline. "But Ma," Mark began, his voice faltering as the argument swirled in his head. "We could use the help, just for a little while. Maybe we don't have to take everything he offers, but what if this is our chance to fix things?" His mother's eyes darkened and she stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "I don't want anything from him," she snapped. "That kind of help comes with a price, Mark. And you know what they say about people who offer too much?" Mark recoiled, his chest tightening. He knew his mother was strong, but sometimes it felt like her pride was a wall keeping him out and keeping him from seeing the truth. This wasn't just about pride, though. This was about survival. And no matter how much she wanted to refuse, Mark knew they couldn't go on like this forever. He clenched his fists, the card still in his pocket like an unspoken promise. A way out. A chance at something better. But what if it came with a price they couldn't afford to pay? As he sat back down, his mind swirled with confusion and fear. The tension between him and his mother was palpable, like a storm that hadn't yet broken. Mark wanted to do the right thing, to honor his mother's wishes. But what if the right thing meant sacrificing everything they had left? The afternoon dragged on in silence, the air thick with unspoken words. Mark's mother busied herself with the endless paperwork, pretending that everything would magically work itself out. But Mark couldn't shake the feeling that their time was running out. He could feel the weight of James's offer pressing against him, the thought of what it could mean gnawing at him from the inside. He wasn't sure what to do next, but one thing was clear. Whatever decision he made, it was going to change everything. Mark stood up and walked toward the door. The weight of the situation hung on him like a cloak. He couldn't keep pretending everything was fine, and he couldn't ignore the reality of what lay ahead. He needed to make a choice. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure what the right one was. The next day, Mark had just stepped outside, his mind still a whirlwind of thoughts about the previous evening. He had hardly slept, too tangled in the mess his family was in, his mom's forced smiles, the overdue bills, and that strange, unsettling business card in his pocket. He walked slowly, his sneakers scraping against the cracked pavement, the world around him feeling a little too loud. His usual routine felt distant. His home, his life, everything felt out of place. As he reached the end of the block, Mark's eyes caught the gleam of something black and shiny parked near the curb. A luxury SUV, sleek and menacing in its quiet grandeur. It didn't belong here, not in this neighborhood, not in front of his house. The vehicle's polished surface gleamed under the afternoon sun, practically screaming wealth and power. Mark instinctively slowed his pace, wondering who in the world would be driving such a car down this street. And then, as if the world was responding to his thoughts, the door swung open. A tall man stepped out. His suit was crisp, perfectly tailored, a dark navy that somehow seemed more expensive than anything Mark had ever worn, or would ever wear. He adjusted his sunglasses slowly before slipping them off and tucking them into his shirt pocket. His smile was wide, practiced, and immediately unsettling. He looked like the kind of person who expected the world to bend to his will. "Mark, dog, right?" The man's voice was smooth, almost too smooth, like something you'd expect from a politician or a businessman who was used to getting what he wanted. "I'm James Howard. My father told me about you, how you helped him with his groceries yesterday." Mark froze, his heart skipping a beat. He wasn't expecting this. He wasn't expecting anyone, let alone someone who looked like he belonged in a different world, to show up, not in the middle of this mess. But there he was, looking all polished and clean, smiling like they were old friends. "Yeah, I helped him," Mark replied, his voice coming out warier than he intended. He swallowed hard, eyeing the man as if he were a stranger who was way too comfortable. "Is everything okay?" James laughed lightly, a sound that didn't quite match the situation. He seemed completely at ease, almost enjoying the awkwardness of the moment. "Everything's fine. I just wanted to thank you for helping my father yesterday. He said you were a big help, and I'd like to return the favor." Mark stood still, unsure how to respond. Part of him wanted to laugh. Return the favor? The favor didn't feel like a favor, not when he could barely manage to make ends meet at home. But instead of pushing back, he felt his pulse race. This whole thing felt off, too easy, too smooth. James took a step closer, the smile never fading from his face. Mark tensed, instinctively retreating a step, as James extended a crisp business card toward him. "If you ever need anything, work, money, whatever, you can give me a call," James said, his tone friendly but detached, as though this was just another transaction to him. Mark stared at the card for a moment, the weight of it in his hand making his chest tighten. It wasn't just a business card. It was a lifeline dangling in front of him, a way out from the crushing weight of their financial struggles. But something about it felt wrong, like an offer from someone who had more to gain than just a thank you. Mark blinked, shaking the unease off as best he could. He didn't want to seem ungrateful, but the idea of taking anything from this stranger, from this world so far removed from his own, made him uncomfortable. And yet, here it was, a solution, a chance. "Thanks," Mark said, his voice quieter than he meant. His eyes flicked up to James's face, meeting his gaze for just a moment before he turned toward the house. "I'll think about it." James's smile remained, not a hint of surprise, no indication that Mark's hesitation had fazed him in the slightest. "Take care, Mark. I'm sure we'll talk soon." As James got back into the SUV and it slowly rolled away, Mark stood there, staring at the space where it had been. His heart pounded in his chest as he clutched the card tighter, the words echoing in his mind. Work, money, whatever. But at what cost? Inside the house, the familiar, oppressive silence greeted him. His mother sat at the kitchen table, her shoulders hunched in exhaustion, the sharp lines of worry etched across her face. Mark could hear the faint scratching of her pen against paper as she filled out another form or bill. There was always something to fill out, always something to sign. He dropped his backpack by the door, the weight of the business card heavy in his pocket. He didn't want to tell her. He knew what she would say. She'd probably refuse, probably get angry, maybe tell him it was a bad idea. But the rent notice sitting on the counter like a ticking bomb was hard to ignore. They were running out of time, and this offer was their only real chance. He walked into the kitchen, his footsteps hesitant. He could feel his mother's eyes on him before he even said anything. She didn't need to ask. She already knew something was up. "Who's this from, Mark?" Her voice was tight, sharp, with the kind of suspicion that came from years of battling people who always had an agenda. She didn't look up, but her tone made it clear that whatever it was, she wasn't going to like it. Mark hesitated, his fingers playing with the edge of the card before finally pulling it out. He placed it on the table, his hand still trembling slightly. "It's from James Howard, Mr. Howard's son." His mother didn't move. Her gaze fell to the card and the muscles in her jaw tightened. She reached out, finger hovering over the card for just a second before she pushed it aside with a quick motion. "People like that don't help without expecting something in return," she said, her voice low, almost a growl. She looked up at Mark, her face flushed with frustration. "We don't owe anyone, especially not someone like him." Mark felt his chest tighten. He knew exactly where this was headed. His mother was proud, stubborn, and she wouldn't accept help from someone like James Howard, not for anything. The way she spoke, with such certainty, made Mark want to scream. She didn't understand what they were facing. She didn't see the mountain of bills, the rent notices piling up. "I don't think he's asking for anything in return," Mark said, his voice quieter than he intended. "He just wants to help. And Ma, we really need it." His mother shook her head, the frustration in her eyes shifting to something darker. "It's not help, Mark. People like him don't do things for free. There's always a catch. You don't take things from people like that, not without paying a price. Do you understand?" Mark nodded, but the words felt hollow. He understood, but he also understood something else. Their situation wasn't going to get better on its own. The bills weren't going to disappear, and at some point, he was going to have to make a choice. A choice between his mother's pride and the desperate need to fix things. As his mother turned back to her papers, Mark felt like the walls were closing in around him. He wasn't sure what was right anymore. Should he call James? Should he accept the help and risk whatever it might cost them later? Or should he stick to his mother's wishes and refuse help from someone who might be the only person who could actually change things? The weight of the decision pressed down on him, and he knew that whatever path he chose, things would never be the same again. The days crawled by, each one heavier than the last. Mark couldn't shake the feeling of the clock ticking. The eviction notice loomed over them like a shadow that grew darker with each passing hour. His mom had tried her best to act like everything was fine, but Mark saw the way her shoulders hunched, the way her smile faltered. She was doing what she always did, pretending things were okay, even when they clearly weren't. Mark spent his days watching the walls of their small home close in around him. His mind buzzed with questions, with uncertainty, but most of all, with guilt. Was it right to accept help from someone like James Howard? His mom's refusal to even consider it echoed in his head. She was proud, too proud to accept charity. But what were they supposed to do when their backs were against the wall? The rent was overdue. They couldn't make it through another month like this. So Mark decided it wasn't about pride anymore. It was about survival. And when the eviction deadline loomed even closer, the day James returned wasn't a surprise, it was inevitable. The black SUV pulled up outside their house again, its shiny surface reflecting the gray sky. The sound of the engine cutting off was like the last nail in a coffin that Mark had been too afraid to acknowledge. James stepped out, his usual easy smile in place, but Mark couldn't bring himself to return it. His mother was in the kitchen, her back to the door, her hands busy with the mountain of papers that had become her life. James didn't wait for an invitation. He walked up the steps and rang the doorbell. The sound of the chime felt like a warning. Mark opened the door, his nerves on edge. "Mark," James said, his tone smooth and friendly as ever. "I just wanted to check in. See how you're doing." He handed Mark another business card. "If you need anything, don't hesitate to call me." Mark's hand froze as he took the card. His heart pounded in his chest as he glanced up at James. The words felt hollow now, like they were spoken too many times already. But Mark wasn't sure what else to do. The pressure of everything was choking him. "Thanks," Mark said, his voice barely above a whisper, unable to find the right words. Inside, his mom's voice sliced through the air. "We don't need charity. We can manage on our own." Mark's stomach tightened. He felt the weight of her words, but he couldn't help the anger that bubbled up inside him. She was doing it again, pretending like they were fine, like they weren't drowning. He turned toward his mom, watching as she stood there, arms crossed, her jaw set firm. James Thops remained calm, even as his smile faltered for a moment. "Of course," he said, his voice still polite, though the warmth had faded slightly. "I just wanted to help." Mark could see the slight discomfort in James's posture, but it was quickly masked with the practiced ease of someone used to getting what he wanted. James wasn't bothered by the rejection, not really. He'd offered, and in his world that was enough. The rest was up to Mark. Mark's eyes lingered on the business card in his hand, his thoughts swirling. His mom was right about one thing. James wasn't doing this out of the kindness of his heart. But there were times when kindness came with strings attached. Mark had learned that lesson early on. The question now was, what choice did they really have? Later that day, Mark found himself standing in the kitchen, the business card staring at him from the counter. His mother had buried herself in her endless paperwork again, not saying a word about the conversation earlier. But Mark knew the truth. They couldn't keep going like this. If things didn't change, they'd be out on the streets, just another family swallowed up by their circumstances. Without thinking, he reached for the phone. The screen was bright in his hand, almost mocking him with its simplicity. But the number on the business card didn't seem as daunting anymore. He had no other option. He dialed the number, his fingers shaking as the phone rang in his ear. It felt wrong, almost like betrayal. But his heart hammered in his chest. The sound of the line clicking on made him jump. "Hello?" James's voice came through, smooth and composed as if nothing had changed. "It's Mark," he said, his voice raw. I need your help. I don't know what else to do." There was a brief pause before James replied, his voice steady. "I understand, Mark. Don't worry. We'll take care of it." The relief that washed over Mark was almost too much to bear, but that feeling was quickly replaced with an undercurrent of unease. They had no choice now. He had just opened a door that couldn't be closed. When James showed up that evening, it was as if nothing had changed. He was still the same polished, confident man who seemed to glide through life without a care. But this time, when he stepped into their home, there was something different in his eyes. The offer was real. "I heard about your situation," James said, his voice calm and measured as he sat down at the kitchen table. "I want to make sure you don't have to worry about the rent for a while. I can take care of it." Mark's mom was standing by the counter, her arms crossed, her eyes narrowed in suspicion. She looked like a woman who had been beaten down by the world and had no more fight left in her, but there was still that defiance in her eyes. "I don't like this," she said, her voice low, barely above a whisper. "I don't like it at all." James didn't flinch. He knew how this worked. "I understand, Mrs. Cartwright," he said with a polite nod, "but I just want to make sure you're taken care of. This offer is open, and I mean it. No strings attached." Mark's mom hesitated, her gaze flickering between Mark and James. It was clear that every instinct inside her screamed to refuse, but the reality of their situation crushed her defenses. She had always fought to keep things in her control, to make sure Mark never felt the weight of the world too much, but now the weight was unbearable. "I guess we don't have a choice," she muttered reluctantly, her voice tight. Her gaze stayed fixed on the table, her hands trembling as they gripped the edge. Mark could feel the air shift in the room, heavy with the tension of an unspoken agreement. The moment had arrived, and there was no turning back. The walls of pride and stubbornness that his mother had built around their family were crumbling, and Mark felt the surge of something. Relief, desperation, guilt, coursing through him. "I'll take care of the rent," James repeated, his voice like a lifeline thrown into the storm, "and I'll help with whatever else you need." Mark's heart hammered in his chest, the weight of what they were agreeing to sinking in. This wasn't just about rent anymore. It was about survival, about letting someone like James Howard into their lives, a man whose motives he couldn't fully trust. But at the same time, he couldn't shake the thought that maybe this was the chance they'd been waiting for. Maybe this was the break they needed to get out of the mess they were in. Mark's mom didn't speak again, but the tension in her eyes told him everything he needed to know. She didn't trust James, didn't want to accept his help, but what other choice did they have? She knew, deep down, that this was the only way out. As James left, Mark felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He didn't know if this was the right choice or the wrong one. He didn't know if they could trust James. But for now, it was the only choice that made sense. And as the door closed behind James, Mark knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The path ahead was uncertain, and the price of their survival hadn't yet been revealed. But they had stepped into a new world, and there was no turning back. Mark's hands were raw from hours of scrubbing and fixing, his muscles aching under the relentless weight of the maintenance tasks James had assigned him. The tasks were menial but steady, a way to prove his worth, to show he wasn't just some charity case. But as he worked, a sinking feeling clawed at him, an ever-present reminder that he wasn't truly free from the weight of his choices. The tenants in the building seemed to know everything about him. He could hear their whispers even through the thick walls of the building, their voices low and conspiratorial, like a dark cloud that had followed him in. "What's that kid doing here? He's working for James now," one tenant murmured to another, the words slicing through the silence of the hallway. "Must be some kind of deal. Maybe he's in over his head." Mark's stomach churned, the words sticking to him like the dust on the floor beneath his feet. He had to ignore them, had to keep working, but their judgment gnawed at him, every whispered phrase feeling like a barb that pierced through the fragile walls he had tried so hard to build. "I can't let them get to me," he told himself, gritting his teeth as he continued wiping down the counters in the hallway, his hands moving mechanically. But the weight of their words lingered, like a shadow that refused to leave him. Their judgment wasn't just about his work. It was about everything. About the fact that he had accepted help. About the fact that he had taken the lifeline James had thrown at him. And now, there he was, working for James in this soulless building, feeling like a piece of something he couldn't quite understand. Mark clenched his fists, his knuckles turning white as the frustration built within him. He hadn't wanted this. He hadn't wanted to be here, doing this job for someone who seemed to have everything, while he had nothing. He hadn't wanted to feel like the charity case, the one who couldn't stand on his own. He was supposed to be helping his mom, saving their home, not scraping at the edges of James's world. But here he was, stuck in this corner of it, unable to escape the growing sense of being trapped. A harsh clang broke his thoughts as the mop handle slipped from his hands. He bent down to pick it up, but his breath caught in his throat when he saw a figure standing in the doorway. James, watching him with an unreadable expression on his face. "You're doing good work," James said, his voice smooth, but there was something sharp in his eyes, something calculating. Mark stood up slowly, wiping the sweat from his brow, the exhaustion thick in his limbs. "Thanks," he muttered, not sure if the praise was sincere or part of some hidden agenda. "You know," James continued, stepping further into the hallway, "you don't have to keep all this bottled up, Mark. I've been where you are. I know what it's like to feel like you're carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders." Mark stiffened, anger flaring in his chest. He wanted to lash out, to tell James that he had no idea what it was like to be him, to be stuck in this suffocating situation. But the words caught in his throat, trapped by the reality that James was the one in control now. "I'm just doing what I have to do," Mark said, his voice low, his fists clenched. He turned away quickly, focusing on his work again, trying to shut out the conversation, but the tension hung between them like a thick fog. James watched him for a moment, his gaze sharp and calculating, before he spoke again. "I'm just saying, you don't have to prove anything to me. We've all got our roles to play. You're here to work, and I'm here to help you make sure you don't fall back into the hole you're in." Mark didn't answer. The words were too much, too heavy. He wanted to walk away, to scream at James that he wasn't some pawn in a game, that he wasn't just there to be helped, to be fixed. But he didn't say anything. He just kept cleaning, his hands moving faster now, his frustration bubbling beneath the surface. The weight of everything, his mom's distrust, the gossip from the tenants, the constant feeling of being judged. As Mark continued his work, the pressure of the day built to a breaking point. He had been so focused on trying to prove something, trying to stay strong, that he hadn't noticed the mounting storm in his chest until it was too late. His thoughts were consumed by the idea that he wasn't good enough, that he had sold himself out for something he wasn't sure he could trust. And then it happened. A loud crash echoed through the hallway, followed by the sound of running footsteps. Mark's heart leapt into his throat as he turned toward the noise. He couldn't believe what he saw. One of the tenants, a middle-aged man who had been making those whispered comments earlier, was standing in the hallway looking furious. "Look at ya," the man spat, his voice thick with disdain. "A kid like you, working for a man like that. You must think you're special, huh? Getting in with the rich guy, playing the game. You don't belong here. You don't belong anywhere. You're nothing but a tool for him, just like the rest of us." Mark's vision blurred for a moment, the words slicing through him like a knife. The anger, the frustration, everything that had been building inside him erupted all at once. His fists clenched, his whole body trembling with the raw emotion he had kept buried for so long. He wasn't some tool, some lowly worker. He wasn't just a charity case. "I'm not like you," Mark shot back, his voice shaking but full of fury. "I'm just trying to survive, and I'll do whatever it takes." The man's face twisted in disbelief. "Survive? You think you're better than us? You think you can crawl into their world and come out clean? It doesn't work like that, kid. You'll end up just like the rest of us, used and forgotten." Mark's heart hammered in his chest as the words settled in his mind. They were true, weren't they? James didn't see him as an equal. He was just a pawn, a tool, a temporary fix to his own problems. Mark had known it deep down, but hearing it from someone else made it real. The anger boiled over and he lashed out, his hands swinging out to strike the man across the face. The sound of flesh meeting flesh echoed through the hallway, leaving both men stunned in the aftermath. "Enough!" James's voice boomed across the hall, his tone sharp and authoritative. He was standing there, his expression dark as he approached, his eyes flicking between Mark and the man. "Both of you, get back to work." Mark stood there, panting, his fists still clenched, his mind a swirl of anger and confusion. He wanted to shout, to scream at James, to tell him everything he had been thinking, but instead, he just stood there, fighting to catch his breath, feeling the weight of the moment. James didn't say anything else. He just stood there, watching Mark for a moment longer before turning on his heel and walking away, leaving Mark alone in the hallway. But Mark didn't feel alone. Not anymore. The storm in his chest, the anger, the frustration. It was all too much to handle. He wanted to throw it all away, to walk out of this place and never look back, to get out from under the shadow of James and his promises. But he couldn't, not yet, not when everything he cared about was still on the line. With one last glance at the hallway, Mark turned back to his work. The weight of everything pressed down on him. He wasn't sure how much longer he could keep going, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let anyone define him. Not James, not the tenants, not anyone. He wasn't a tool, he wasn't a pawn. He was Mark Cartwright, and no matter what happened next, he was going to fight for his place in the world. Mark's footsteps echoed in the quiet street as he made his way home. The paycheck in his pocket felt like a small victory, the paper crinkling as he walked. It wasn't much, but it was a start. It was money that could buy some time, stretch things out just a little longer. The weight of it was reassuring, a reminder that he wasn't completely powerless. But for the first time in a long time, he could breathe a little easier. But that peace didn't last long. As he walked past Mr. Johnson's house, he heard the familiar grating voice of the neighbor shouting from his front gate. "Got yourself mixed up in something, huh?" Mr. Johnson called out, his tone dripping with disdain. "Fancy car, rich guy, what's next?" Mark's blood boiled. The last thing he needed was another judgmental voice in his life. The people in this neighborhood, they never let him forget where he came from, always looking for ways to tear him down when he was trying to build something, trying to get out. Mark clenched his jaw, forcing himself not to respond, but the words came anyway, sharp and low, like a blade he couldn't put away. "It's none of your business, Mr. Johnson," he shot back, trying to ignore the heat rising in his chest. Mr. Johnson just laughed, the sound grating. "Oh, I see. Just another kid who thinks he's special now, huh? You really think you can climb into the world of the rich and come out clean?" Mark didn't stop walking. His heart pounded in his chest, his fists clenching at his sides, but he kept his eyes ahead, determined not to let the bitterness in Mr. Johnson's voice get to him. He wanted to shout back, wanted to make him understand that this wasn't about getting into some world of the rich, that this wasn't about taking handouts. But that's all Mr. Johnson saw. A kid who had been sucked into something bigger than him. To him, Mark was just another person using someone else to get ahead. But Mark wasn't like that. He didn't need anyone to tell him who he was. He didn't need validation. The words weighed on him, but he kept walking. He'd learned long ago that some people couldn't be reasoned with. So he focused on the paycheck in his pocket, the future it could bring. When he finally made it home, the door creaked as he pushed it open, and the warm smell of dinner filled the air. His mom was standing at the stove, stirring something in a pot, her movements slow and methodical, as if the weight of the world was constantly on her shoulders. Mark closed the door softly behind him and took a deep breath before he walked into the kitchen. His mother turned when she heard him, a tired smile flickering across her face when she saw the envelope in his hand. Mark held it out to her and she paused before reaching for it. Her eyes shifted between the envelope and him, a quiet hope in her gaze. "Is this it?" she asked, her voice almost tentative, as if she didn't believe the reality of it. Mark nodded, his heart pounding a little faster. "Yeah, this is what I earned."
His mum's hands trembled slightly as she took the paycheck, the paper crinkling in her grasp. She didn't open it right away. Instead, she stood there for a moment, looking at the money, her face a mixture of relief and something else. Something that Mark couldn't quite name, but it made his chest tighten.
She finally exhaled a deep breath, her shoulders sagging as if the weight she had been carrying for so long had been lifted, even if only a little. "We'll make it work," she said softly, almost to herself. Her eyes flicked up to Mark's, and for the first time in weeks he saw something like hope in them. "But be careful with this, Mark. I don't want you getting too involved." Mark swallowed hard, hearing the concern in her voice, feeling the protective love that had always surrounded him. She had always wanted to shield him from the harshness of the world, but he knew, deep down, that he couldn't stay in her bubble forever. "I know, Ma," he said, his voice quieter now, the weight of her words settling in. "I'll be careful, but for now we're safe." His mom nodded, her hand still gripping the paycheck as if it were the lifeline they had been waiting for. Her face softened, but there was still that quiet worry behind her eyes. "Just remember," she said, her voice gentle but firm, "people like James, they're not always what they seem. You don't want to owe anyone anything you can't pay back." Mark didn't argue. He understood. He knew the world his mother was worried about, the world that she didn't want him to fall into. He could feel the tension in her every word, the way she was trying to protect him from being consumed by something bigger than him. But Mark wasn't sure he could avoid it anymore. The path he was walking on had already been paved, and he wasn't sure where it would take him. He wasn't sure if this was the right choice, but for now, it was the only choice they had. And for now, that had to be enough.
Mark watched his mother closely, seeing the lines on her face, the way she tried to act strong, even when she was clearly struggling. He wanted to tell her it would be okay, but he didn't have the answers. He didn't know if it would be okay, but he was doing what he could to make sure they had another chance. That was all he could do.
The tension between them lingered for a moment, but it wasn't a wall. It was a reminder of how fragile everything was, how close they were to losing everything, and how much was riding on the choices Mark made in the days to come. He didn't want to disappoint her, but he didn't know if they could keep doing this on their own anymore. Finally, Mark spoke again, breaking the silence that had settled in the room. "I make sure we're okay, Ma. I'll keep working, keep doing what I can." She smiled faintly, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Just be careful, Mark. That's all I ask." Mark nodded, though he wasn't sure he could keep the promise. The world was shifting beneath him, and he wasn't sure where it would lead, but for now, for tonight, they had a roof over their heads, food on the table, and the hope that tomorrow would bring something better. That had to be enough.
He reached for the chair at the table and sat down, his mother joining him with the paycheck still in her hands. They ate in silence, the weight of everything hanging between them. Neither of them spoke of the future, not yet. But Mark could feel it, the uncertainty pressing in on all sides.
He wasn't sure how long they would be able to keep up the act, how long he could keep pretending everything was fine. But tonight, they were safe, and that was all that mattered. For now. And as Mark sat there, he couldn't shake the feeling that the hardest part was still ahead. Mark stood in the doorway of the house, the familiar hum of life around him now feeling different. There was a weight in his chest, but it wasn't the burden he had carried for so long. This was a decision, a choice. And it had been hard to make, but it was necessary. He had walked away from James's offer, leaving behind the promises of easy money and quick solutions. He didn't need shortcuts anymore. He walked into the kitchen, where his mom was busy preparing dinner, her movements slow and steady, as they always were when things felt uncertain. Mark stood for a moment, just watching her, the warmth of the room settling over him. "Today was my last day with James," he said, his voice steady but filled with finality. "I think I need to find something more stable." His mother stopped in her tracks, her hands hovering over the stove as she turned to face him. Her eyes softened, her face a mixture of concern and something else. Pride, perhaps. "Are you sure, Mark?" she asked quietly, as if trying to understand the weight of his decision. She hadn't said much when he first started working for James, but Mark knew she had been watching, waiting for him to find his way. It was helping, wasn't it? It helped, but it wasn't the right path. "I can't keep relying on someone like him," Mark replied, his voice calm but resolute. "I need to do this on my own, for us." His mother's face softened even further, and for the first time in a long while, Mark saw the pride in her eyes. She reached out and put her hand on his shoulder, a gesture of support, even though she had been worried about his decision. "I'm proud of you, Mark," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You've done so much for us, but I know you're right. You'll find your way." The words hung in the air, filling the room with a warmth that Mark hadn't felt in a long time. He had been struggling to find his place, to carve out something real for himself and his mom, and now, standing here, he felt like he was finally on the right path. It wasn't about the easy way anymore. It was about building something lasting, something he could be proud of. Later that evening, as they sat down to a modest meal, the relief of the moment wrapped around them like a blanket. The rent was paid, the food on the table was enough. For the first time in a long time, they didn't have to worry about the next bill or the next crisis. They had made it through another tough day together. Mark watched his mother as she passed the plates, the lines on her face softened by the peace of the moment. "We made it, Ma," he said quietly, his voice almost a whisper. She smiled, a small but content smile, as she looked at him across the table.
"Yes, sweetheart, we did."
The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was full of everything they had fought for, everything they had overcome. And for the first time, Mark didn't feel like he was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. The future was uncertain, yes, but they were in this together, and that was enough. After dinner, Mark and his mother went outside to sit on the porch, the quiet of the neighborhood settling around them as the sun dipped lower, casting a soft glow over the street. The evening air was cool, a reminder of the seasons changing, of how time had passed. Mark leaned back in the chair, his hands resting on the arms, looking out at the calm street. He felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in months. Everything was still uncertain, but for the first time, it felt like they were heading in the right direction. "We're gonna be okay, Ma," Mark said quietly, his voice full of a certainty that had been missing for so long. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew they had each other. And that was enough to get through anything. His mom nodded, her eyes meeting his with a soft smile. "Yes, sweetheart, we are." Mark smiled back, his heart lightening as he watched the quiet of the street unfold before him. Despite the challenges that were sure to come, despite the unknowns that lay ahead, he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't alone, and that was all that mattered. They sat there in the stillness, the weight of everything that had passed behind them and everything that was yet to come hanging in the air. But for the first time in a long while, Mark felt at peace. With his mother by his side, they would face whatever came next together. And that was the only thing he needed to know.